Moving to Pine Cove was supposed to mark the beginning of a new chapter in our lives. The small coastal town with its quaint houses and the shimmering ocean on the horizon seemed like the perfect place for a fresh start. Luis and I were full of hope. But as soon as we began unpacking boxes, something inside me clicked. The silence that surrounded us felt more oppressive than I had anticipated. Luis dove into his work, his new project consuming him entirely. I was left alone in our new home, staring at empty rooms and trying to find some purpose in my days. The evenings grew lonelier. Luis came back exhausted, meals remained half-eaten, and our conversations rarely grew into anything more than an exchange of news about our day. One day I decided to take a walk through the town. The small streets with cozy cafes and tiny shops distracted me from my thoughts for a while. I walked along the coast, smelling the salty breeze from the ocean, and thought about how far apart we had grown, despite everything we had been through together. My attention was caught by a winery on the outskirts of town. I had heard about it on our first day here. They said its owner, Thomas, was a well-known and respected man in these parts. But at that moment, it didn't seem important to me. As I walked back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something important was slipping through my fingers. Luis remained absorbed in his work, and I, just a shadow in his world. A few days had passed since my walk through town, and I found myself once again near the winery on the outskirts. This time I ventured closer, admiring the carefully tended vineyards that stretched out to the horizon. The winery felt alive. Everything around it breathed history, and I felt a strange pull toward it. As I reached the main building, the door swung open, and there stood Thomas. He smiled as if he had been expecting me. His confidence and effortless charm were hard to ignore. We exchanged a few words, and he invited me for a tour of his winery. We strolled slowly through the grounds, surrounded by the vast vineyards, and Thomas shared stories about his family and how he inherited this place. His voice was calm and melodic, as though each story he told was a part of him. I found myself intrigued by everything he said, even though winemaking had never been something I cared about before. The atmosphere of the estate, the smell of the earth and grapes, the old walls, it was all mesmerizing. When we reached the old manor, Thomas opened the door and invited me inside. There, among wooden barrels and wine bottles, he continued sharing his history. I could feel something building between us, but I did my best to ignore it. As the evening came to a close, Thomas handed me a bottle of wine. His gesture was friendly, but I noticed something more in his eyes. Holding the bottle in my hands, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn to him, but I tried to suppress it. It's just friendliness, right? With each passing day, my encounters with Thomas became more frequent. At first, it was just random meetings around town, at the market, at a cafe. We would exchange a few words, and soon our conversations grew deeper. Thomas always found something to spark my interest. Personal stories, childhood memories, or simply reflections on life in Pine Cove. I didn't realize how much our talk started to take up my time and thoughts. He had a way of listening that made me want to share more and more. I began telling him things I hadn't shared with anyone in a long time, about my fears, my loneliness, how my marriage with Luis had become something mundane, lacking the closeness we once had. Thomas didn't judge. He simply understood. In his eyes, I saw a warmth that made me feel at ease and made me want to keep talking. One day, after another chance encounter, Thomas suggested we take a walk along the ocean. I agreed without a second thought. We walked along the shore, the ocean breeze tangling my hair. Our conversations stopped being just words. They took on a new tone, more personal, more intimate. I could feel something shifting between us. My inner voice screamed that this was wrong, but I couldn't stop myself. Every glance, every word from him pulled me deeper into this strange and dangerous game. When Thomas stopped and looked at me, I felt my heart start to race. There was something more in his eyes than just friendship. I felt a light thrill that was impossible to ignore. Inside me, something new was awakening, something dangerous, yet thrilling at the same time. Meanwhile, Luis had started noticing my frequent absences. He came home earlier than usual, only to find the house empty. At first, he didn't ask any questions, assuming I was just trying to settle into our new surroundings, finding my own space. He continued working, devoting more time to his projects, and our evenings became silent rituals. Dinner, television, and each of us retreating into our own worlds. I could sense that Luis was beginning to suspect something, but his silence gave me the illusion of safety. He didn't interfere, thinking I was just trying to find my place in this new life. But I knew our connection was weakening with each passing day, and instead of trying to fix it, I was sinking deeper into my new world with Thomas. At the winery, we were spending more and more time alone. Thomas shared stories from his life, thoughts that made me reflect on how much my own world had changed. Sometimes I caught his gaze, full of a mysterious warmth, and it stirred mixed feelings within me. On the one hand, I felt a growing attraction, and on the other, I knew I was crossing a line. But I couldn't pull back anymore. Every time I came home after those meetings, I thought about how far I had come. My friendship with Thomas had clearly turned into something more than just affection. I kept trying to convince myself that it was just friendship, wasn't it? But the deep flutter in my chest reminded me that it had long ceased to be just that. Luis was still there, but his silence became more oppressive. I could feel the storm brewing in our home, and while I kept trying to ignore it, deep down I knew that change was inevitable. That day, Thomas suggested we take a boat ride along the coast. I hadn't expected it, but his invitation felt so natural that I couldn't refuse. We agreed to meet at the port in the late afternoon, just as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky with golden and pink hues. Thomas waited for me at the dock, his calm smile and effortless ease making everything seem so right. I no longer questioned whether I should be there. We set off, the boat gliding slowly along the shoreline, gently swaying with the soft waves. The ocean was calm and the light breeze brushed my face, cooling the warmth of the evening. Thomas spoke about life in Pine Cove, about his winery, and his dreams for the future. I listened, feeling how, with every passing moment, a new bond formed between us, deeper than before. As the sun disappeared behind the horizon, leaving only a warm glow on the water, Thomas stopped the boat. We sat in silence, enjoying the moment. But the quiet was filled with something more than peace. There was tension, the anticipation of something inevitable. I looked at him, feeling an invisible spark pass between us. My hand reached for his without thinking, and in that moment everything inside me changed. Sensing it, Thomas looked at me with that same look I had noticed before but had been afraid to acknowledge. Slowly, he leaned closer, and I did nothing to stop him. His lips softly touched mine, and time seemed to stand still. In that moment, there was no Luis, no guilt, no questions. There was only Thomas, the sunset, and the ocean. This kiss was the first step, and I knew there would be no turning back. We pulled away, and as if waking from a dream, I realized what had just happened. The excitement gave way to a heavy weight in my heart. I knew I had betrayed Luis. The realization hit me like a wave, but along with it came another feeling. I couldn't deny my feelings for Thomas. This kiss wasn't just a mistake. It was something I had suppressed for so long but could no longer ignore. As I made my way back home, I felt as if I were in a daze. My thoughts were jumbled, fear and excitement swirling together with an inexplicable joy and a sense of freedom. But at the same time, I knew that this step would change everything. I wanted to return to what was before, but I understood that the way back was already closed. After that boat trip, something inside me had changed for good. My meetings with Thomas became more frequent, but now they were in secret. Every morning I woke up thinking about the next time I would see him. Lying to Luis became second nature. I'd tell him I had errands to run or claim I was meeting new acquaintances in town. But the truth was that all my thoughts and time were devoted to Thomas. We met in secluded places. Sometimes at his winery when none of his workers could see us, sometimes along the coast, where the ocean's waves drowned out our secrets. In these meetings, I found what was missing in my marriage. With Thomas, I felt alive, important, desired. His attention, his words, and his looks filled the void Luis had left with his constant busyness. Each of our meetings was like a breath of fresh air. We could talk about anything, and it felt like Thomas understood me in ways Luis hadn't in a long time. There was no formality, no expectations, only genuine feelings and passion that I tried to suppress, but which grew stronger with every encounter. I knew it was a dangerous game, but I couldn't stop. The more time I spent with Thomas, the less time there was for Luis. He started noticing my frequent absences. In the past, he accepted my explanations without question, but now I could feel his gaze lingering on me, full of suspicion. He no longer believed my excuses about errands or walks, and this only heightened my anxiety. One evening at dinner, when the silence between us became too much, Luis suddenly asked, "Jenna, where do you keep disappearing to?" His voice was calm, but I sensed the worry behind his words. I tried to brush it off, saying I was just getting used to the new place, trying to find something for myself, but his eyes told me he wasn't convinced. In the days that followed, Luis started asking more questions. "You were gone a long time again. Where were you? Or why didn't you call?" With every question, my tension grew. I knew he was starting to suspect something. His behavior changed. Where he used to ignore my comings and goings, now he watched my every step. He began staying home more, as if trying to figure out what I was doing in his absence. It created more pressure, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep my secret. Yet, despite all this, I continued seeing Thomas. These meetings became more than just an escape from everyday life. They were my breath of freedom, something I so desperately lacked in my marriage. I knew I was doing something wrong, but I couldn't walk away. Thomas was filling the emptiness inside me. I was sinking deeper into this relationship, even as Luis's suspicions grew. My life started to feel like the ocean, calm on the surface, but beneath the waters, powerful currents were swirling, threatening to destroy everything. But I had already gone too far to turn back. I stood at the entrance to the winery, feeling the rising tension in my chest. Every step I took toward Thomas felt both right and terrifying. We had crossed too many lines, ones we could never return from. But today there was something different in the air, something heavy and suffocating. When I entered, Thomas was already waiting for me in his office. He greeted me with the same smile that always reassured me, as if there was nothing complicated or wrong between us. But this time I couldn't ignore the sense of impending danger. Our eyes met, and something long buried under light conversations and innocent touches ignited between us. We talked for a long time about nothing, as if we were afraid to voice what was lingering in the air. But with each passing minute, our words lost meaning, and all that remained between us were our emotions, sharp, pulsing, unbearably heavy. Thomas took a step closer, and I couldn't look away. His hands gently touched my shoulders, and everything inside me trembled. I knew I was taking a step further than ever before, but I couldn't stop. His lips found mine, and in that moment, I lost control over my thoughts and feelings. Everything I had suppressed broke free. We kissed passionately, and the world around us ceased to exist. All that remained were our bodies, our emotions, this uncontrollable attraction. His hands explored my body, and I felt my boundaries crumble one by one. I knew this was too far. I had crossed a line I should never have crossed. But stopping was impossible. My hands gripped him tighter, and it felt like the last breath of air before diving into depths from which there was no return. We were in his office, locked in this moment of passion, and I couldn't think, couldn't resist. When we finally stopped, both of us were breathless. My clothes were slightly disheveled, my hair scattered over my shoulders, and my heart pounded so loudly it felt like the whole winery could hear it. I felt both drained and overwhelmed with emotions, as if a storm raged inside me. I knew I had to leave, gathering my strength. I quickly straightened my clothes and stepped out of the office. But as soon as I entered the hallway, fear struck me. Standing at the doorway was Luis. He looked at me, and there was no doubt in his eyes. He knew exactly what had happened. The silence was deafening. I met his gaze, and for a moment time stood still. But then I saw the anger flare in his eyes, his fists clenched. He didn't say a word, but his expression said everything. I felt my heart tighten with fear and guilt. This moment, when everything collapsed, came so suddenly. I knew I had destroyed something important, but even that realization didn't pull me back to reality. All I could feel was despair and helplessness. In that instant, I realized that the road back was closed to me forever. The moment Luis met my eyes, I knew there would be no chance for explanations. His face was tense, his eyes burning with fury. Before I could take a step toward him, he stormed toward Thomas's office like an explosion that had been building up, finally breaking loose. "Do you think I don't see what's going on?" His voice echoed through the winery as he burst into Thomas's office. Thomas seemed to expect this, standing calmly, though tension was evident in his eyes. It was as if he knew that the moment of inevitable confrontation had finally arrived. Luis didn't give any of us time to speak. "You destroyed my family," he shouted, pointing a finger at Thomas. "You used her, got into our marriage, and ruined everything." His words were full of pain and fury, impossible to hold back. Despite the intensity of the situation, Thomas didn't react with anger, which only seemed to enrage Luis even more. I tried to step forward to intervene, but the words stuck in my throat. "Luis, this isn't what it looks like," I began, but my voice was too weak. I knew it looked exactly as he saw it, and there was no excuse for what had happened. Luis's eyes landed on me for a brief moment, and in them, I saw a mix of hurt and disappointment. "Not what it looks like, I saw you!" His voice broke into a bitter laugh. He stepped closer to me and then quickly turned back to Thomas. "You ruined everything. Everything we had, everything we built. And you, Jenna," his voice wavered, but the anger surged again as he looked back at me. "You betrayed me. For what? For this lie, this deception?" I tried to speak again, but Luis cut me off sharply. "Don't you dare say a word. You lost the right to justify yourself." His voice was a yell, and I felt my heart tighten. Thomas stood nearby, silent, but his presence only made things worse. "You know what I'm going to do? I'm filing for divorce, and I don't want to hear any excuses. You destroyed everything, Jenna. I don't care about you anymore." His words were cold as steel, cutting straight through me. I tried to grasp that this wasn't just a fit of anger. He meant it. My world collapsed in an instant. Luis turned and stormed out of the office without looking back. I stood frozen, feeling confusion and fear overwhelming me. Thomas cautiously stepped closer, but I stepped back, unsure how to react. My mind was in complete chaos. I had destroyed my marriage, my life, and now I had no idea what to do next. I stayed with Thomas. After Luis left, the sound of the door slamming shut felt like it had closed off my entire past life. In that moment, in the silence of Thomas's office, I realized there was no going back. We had destroyed everything that existed between me and Luis, and I had been the one to throw the last embers of our relationship into the flames. Now only ashes remained. Thomas was there as I sat, feeling the world around me crumble. He placed a hand on my shoulder, trying to comfort me, but his touch didn't bring the peace I had hoped for. Inside me, a storm raged, a mix of guilt, regret, and uncertainty. I looked at him and tried to force a smile, but all that came out was a pitiful reflection of my true feelings. I decided to stay with him because I didn't know where else to go. Luis was ready to sever ties, and my family felt shattered. Thomas became the only anchor I could grasp in this sea of chaos. But instead of finding calm, I felt uneasy. Nothing in my new life brought me peace. My marriage was dead, and the new future that had once seemed so alluring had suddenly turned into a vast unknown, full of fear. Thomas was attentive, but I could see that he too felt different. We were no longer the people who secretly met, indulging in thrilling moments. Now everything had changed. The passion that once felt natural and desirable now reminded me of the price I had paid. My family. Every time I looked at him, echoes of guilt reverberated inside me. I often woke up at night with a heavy heart, staring at the ceiling and trying to convince myself that I had made the right choice. But it was hard to convince myself, and with each passing night, these doubts grew stronger. Living with Thomas now seemed less like salvation and more like a new challenge I didn't know how to face. He supported me, tried to distract me from my dark thoughts. We spent time at the winery, shared moments together, but I couldn't find peace. I realized that I had destroyed my life for what once seemed like a fresh start, but in reality, it had been nothing more than an escape. An escape from Luis, from problems, from myself. I had destroyed my family for the sake of the unknown. And now that unknown seemed overwhelming. I tried to forget what had happened, to push away thoughts of Luis and what I had done. But it was impossible. The ashes of the past, settling over everything around me, made it hard to breathe. Every moment reminded me of what I had lost. And although I tried to build a new relationship with Thomas, deep down I knew I could never free myself from the ghosts of the past. But there was only one thought left. I had to move forward. I couldn't go back, and no amount of regret would change what had already happened. All I could do was try to build something new, despite everything that had been destroyed. But something inside me told me it wouldn't be that easy. Thomas and I decided to move into his house near the vineyards. It was supposed to be the start of a new life, a clean slate. Thomas suggested that it would make things easier, moving away from memories, from everything that reminded us of the past. His house was on the outskirts of town, surrounded by vineyards on all sides, creating an illusion of seclusion and peace. I thought this place would save us. But as time went on, I began to realize that this life was far from what I had expected. From the very beginning, the house was filled with a silence that weighed on me. Thomas was busy with his work, absorbed in the winery, and I spent long hours alone. We spent our evenings together, but our conversations became increasingly mundane. At first, I thought it was just part of adjusting to our new life. But the further we went, the more I felt that an invisible wall had risen between us. I started noticing little things that I had previously overlooked. Thomas grew impatient when I tried to talk about my feelings, as if my emotions had become foreign to him. Our arguments began over trivial things. He would forget my requests, and I would get irritated over nothing. What had once seemed so alluring, his confidence, his independence, now only caused tension. I realized that our relationship had been built on passion, on those moments when we were hiding from the real world. But now that there were no barriers between us, it all seemed hollow. Every night, I woke up with a heaviness in my heart. It felt like the house, the vineyards, this new life with Thomas that I had chosen was more like a cage. The silence grew deafening, and the loneliness unbearable. I longed for freedom, but I couldn't even define what I meant by freedom. Leaving Luis hadn't brought me the relief I thought it would. Instead, I found myself trapped by my own decisions. Thomas and I began arguing more frequently over small things. He was frustrated with my questions about the future, with my doubts. He didn't want to talk about what was next for us, and I felt increasingly lost. Our discussions about the future seemed so empty, devoid of the emotions that had once brought us together. We had lost the lightness that we once shared. It felt like everything that connected us was passion, a temporary feeling that was now fading. I looked at Thomas and realized that the magic that had once captivated me was quickly disappearing. Our relationship seemed fragile, as if it had no real foundation. Every morning I woke up with the sense that something was wrong, but I couldn't find the words to explain it. Thomas was here, physically present, but I felt more alone than ever. With each passing day, I realized that I might have destroyed my previous life for something fleeting, for a dream that was never meant to become reality. There was no longer the closeness between Thomas and me that I had hoped for. We had lost something vital, and I didn't know how to get it back. Weeks passed, and I was trying to come to terms with my new life. Each day brought new challenges, and even though I was with Thomas, thoughts of Luis still lingered in my mind. I knew I should leave him in the past, but memories of what had been haunted me. One day, while chatting with a local acquaintance, I inadvertently learned that Luis had a new girlfriend. Her tone was light, as if it were simple curiosity, but I felt something inside me tighten. "She's wonderful, you know," she said. "They have a stable and happy relationship. It seems he's found someone who really suits him." Those words hit me like a slap in the face. I tried to suppress the surge of jealousy that rose within me. Why did this affect me so much? We had broken up, and I had chosen my own path. I had no right to feel this way. Yet jealousy consumed me. Luis had proven to be stronger than I had expected. Not only could he live without me, but he had found someone new with whom he could build a relationship. Every time I looked at Thomas, I remembered how easy he was to talk to, how he showered me with attention. But now all of that felt insignificant compared to what I had heard about Luis. In that moment, I realized I hadn't just lost a husband. I had lost someone important to me, and now he was continuing his life without me. Thomas and I tried to mend our relationship, but I knew there was a weight on my heart. Every time we spent time together, A thought of Luis and his new life flitted through my mind. I kept asking myself, did I really make the right choice? Something inside me hinted that I was merely running away from reality. I decided to talk to Thomas about my feelings, hoping it would help me sort things out. But when I tried to explain to him what I was experiencing, his reaction surprised me. He didn't understand why I kept thinking about Luis. "You need to let him go, Jenna. He's in the past," he said, but his words felt like a reprimand rather than support. At that moment, I realized that my relationship with Thomas wasn't as solid as I had thought. I couldn't just forget about Luis. I couldn't take everything that existed between us and erase it. My feelings were tangled, and no matter how hard I tried to focus on the new, the shadow of the past still lingered. I understood that I needed to come to terms with my emotions. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to move forward. Maybe Luis truly was stronger than I thought. His new life became a reminder of what I had lost. I couldn't remain with Thomas while my heart still held space for the old. And thus began the real struggle, between the past and the future, between what I knew and what I still had to discover. With each passing week, it became increasingly clear to me that my relationship with Thomas was continuing to deteriorate. What had once filled me with excitement and joy now felt like a shadow, a fleeting memory of what could have been. The passion that had once burned between us now seemed faded, like autumn leaves losing their vibrancy. I tried to ignore these changes, continuing with daily life, but inside me a sense of emptiness grew. Every time we spent time together, I felt an invisible chasm stretching between us. Thomas had become more withdrawn and irritable. His patience was wearing thin. I knew that part of this was due to me, my constant doubts and internal turmoil. I couldn't explain what was wrong, but I felt we were both playing a game that no longer made sense. Sometimes we spent evenings in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. I would look at him and realize that beneath his confident exterior lay his own fears and insecurities. But no matter how much I tried to keep the conversation flowing, his responses became colder and more restrained. I understood that this wasn't just a rough patch, it was the reality I couldn't face. The passion that had once connected us was quickly fading, and there was nothing romantic about it. One day, sitting on the porch and gazing out at the vineyards, I realized that I could no longer stay in a relationship based on illusions. I didn't feel happy with Thomas anymore, and this realization was painful. We had built our relationship on dreams, on a passion that had ultimately proven to be fleeting. I had lost myself trying to please someone else. With every passing moment, it became clearer to me that I needed to make a decision. I didn't want to continue this struggle with myself and with Thomas, which was leading nowhere. I had to be honest with both him and myself. No feelings could extinguish the fact that our relationship was no longer what it had once been. I knew I had to gather all my courage and talk to Thomas. I didn't want to hurt him, but staying in this relationship felt like prolonging the suffering. I understood that all this time, we had only been hiding from reality, and it was time to face it head on. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I resolved to tell him the truth. This decision required bravery, but I could no longer remain trapped in illusions. I looked at the vineyards, which had once seemed like a symbol of a new life, and realized that now they served as a reminder that I needed to let go. I walked into my room and began to pack my things. It was bittersweet. The memories of the time spent with Thomas washed over me like a wave of nostalgia, but I knew it was necessary. Each item I placed in my bag reminded me of what had been and what I was leaving behind. I tried not to dwell on the past, but the memories of happy moments lingered. As I finished packing, another thought struck me. How would I tell Thomas? I didn't want it to come as a shock, but I knew that postponing the conversation would only increase the pain. After all, this was the right decision for both of us. Summoning my courage, I headed toward his office. My heart pounded in my chest, and I understood that this would not be an easy conversation, but I knew it was necessary. When I walked into the room, Thomas looked at me with anticipation, and I saw the worry reflected in his eyes. "Thomas, I need to talk to you," I began, and those words were the last thread connecting us. I realized that this decision would change everything, but I was ready to embrace this challenge. I had to leave behind what no longer brought me happiness and finally find myself. After my conversation with Thomas, where he insisted we try again, I felt my resolve strengthening. His words came with hope, but I knew that returning to the past made no sense. We had been through too much, and all that passion that once felt real now reminded me only of the illusions I had believed in. I was determined that I needed to leave. When the time came to say goodbye, my heart raced. I knew it would be difficult, but my inner voice told me I was on the right path. I packed my things and took one last look at the house among the vineyards, which had become a symbol of both happiness and pain for me. I was missing only one thing: true happiness. As I drove to my parents' house, mixed emotions swirled within me. I didn't know what awaited me ahead, but the realization that I was leaving my romance with Thomas behind brought some relief. I couldn't forget that it was a chapter in my life, but now I was ready to leave it in the past and build something new. When I arrived at my parents' home, I was welcomed with warmth and care. It was what I had missed so much lately. I felt the world around me starting to rebuild. My parents were delighted to see me, and their support filled me with hope. I knew I needed time to sort through my feelings and redefine who I was. With each passing day, I began to heal slowly. I started engaging in activities that brought me joy. Hobbies I hadn't pursued in years, outdoor walks, and simply connecting with people who cared about me. I realized that the trials I had faced helped me discover myself. I learned to appreciate the simple things and understand that happiness doesn't always come in bright colors. Sometimes it is hidden in the ordinary. The past remained with me like a shadow, but I learned to find the strength within myself to move forward. I understood that my romance with Thomas had been a mistake, but it had also served as a lesson I needed to learn to become the person I was now. I couldn't change the past, but I could shape my future. That night, lying in my old room, I resolved that the next chapter of my life needed to be written with new understanding and clarity. I didn't know what awaited me ahead, but I was ready to face it with an open heart and mind. This new chapter was beginning, and I was filled with hope for what it would bring me. Everything I had been searching for: